Will include Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. That will be followed by House Speaker John Boehner, and then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Fellow members of Congress about the dangerous threats posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran's evil intent has been confronted by the fighter's fist of Senator Reid. He has supported 6 sanction acts against the Islamic Republic. Last year, he oversaw the unanimous approval of the Comprehensive Iran Sanction and Divestment Act. While Iran's nuclear progress has been slowed, we know it has not been stopped. But we also know that Senator Reid will continue to do everything he can to prevent Iran from acquiring the world's most dangerous weapon. But Iran is not the only issue Harry Reid has been a leader on. We know that not a day goes by without Israel's right of self-defense being challenged. Who can forget exactly 1 year ago how the international community ignored all clear evidence and quickly blamed Israel when its brave soldiers were attacked as they properly boarded a flotilla ship attempting to break the blockade of the Gaza Strip. But the Majority Leader in the United States Senate supported our ally Israel. Senator Reid and his Republican counterpart Mitch McConnell encouraged 85 senators to a clear bipartisan message to the enemies of the Jewish state. 8 unmistakable words. We fully support Israel's right to self-defense. In that same spirit, Senator Reid has always helped ensure that support for Israel's security never became a partisan issue. This past spring, when Congress was entrenched in intense debate about budget cuts, the Majority Leader never allowed Israel's assistance to become an issue. And in fact, he advocated for increased funding for critical projects like the Iron Dome rocket defense system. Israel's citizens in the South have had 10,000 rockets fired at their homes and communities in the past 10 years. The bottom line is Harry Reid advocates for funding that saves Israeli lives. Ladies and gentlemen, standing with us today is a man who presses for Israel's security and demands that justice for the ages be done. A man who not only talks as a great friend of Israel, but acts on his words. A man who fights as our friend and leads as our friend. He will always be our friend. Join me in welcoming this extraordinary man, Senator Harry Reid.
We meet this year in the shadow of Israel's birthday, but our mood is not one of celebration. Our mood is one of caution and concern. Unease sits heavily on our shoulders. This is because at no time in Israel's history has our future faced such tension and such serious tests. Uncertainty awaits us on many fronts. And never in AIPAC's history have so many of you, leaders, advocates, students, and concerned citizens, gathered to make your voices heard. Your tireless activism has made you an unparalleled force, not only in this town, but throughout the country and the world. It's not only your numbers or your passion that has made you effective and earned you the success you deserve. It's the virtue of your cause and the integrity of your conviction. You're in the arena, in the fight, year after year. When the headwinds pick up, you push back even harder. And today, here, we're united, determined, demanding strength and success. We insist that Israel not only survives, but thrives. And I'm honored to stand before you this evening to say that, like you, I stand with Israel always. I'll make sure the United States stands with Israel every time. I will do this as Majority Leader of the United States Senate. And I'll do this in my most important job as a senior senator from the state of Nevada, the home to the fastest growing Jewish community in the country, a spirited pro-Israel community, and the home to many AIPAC members here tonight, including my good friend and the next senator from the state of Nevada, Shelley Berkeley. I stand with Israel, the Congress stands with Israel, and America stands with Israel, because the values that have cast our histories are one and the same, and our futures will be intertwined even more than our history has been. You know, here are the values. You know them: democracy, opportunity, justice, strength, security and self-defense, innovation, peace. These values fasten the unbreakable bond between the United States and the State of Israel. We also share a common confidence that the risks we take are right. Israel and America meet great challenges with the faith that we're fighting the good fight. This month began with a daring mission the world will long remember. The raid that got bin Laden was unprecedented in its significance, but to those who know their history, it was not unfamiliar. 35 years earlier, in the summer of 1976, Israel showed the world how it's done. Many of you remember, terrorists took a hijacked plane to Entebbe, Uganda, where they freed only the non-Jewish passengers. After days of deliberation, Israel's leaders decided to conduct its first ever mission outside the Middle East, far, far from home. The rescue was as dangerous as it was ingenious. The Israeli troops flew into Entebbe's airport under the cover of night. To deceive the guards on the ground, they drove to the terminal in a Mercedes and Land Rover motorcade, identical to the one the Ugandan president would use to travel. Less than an hour later, while Americans celebrated the bicentennial of our independence, more than 100 Jewish hostages discovered their freedom. The only troop Israel lost that day was Prime Minister Netanyahu's brave older brother, Yoni. Many of the elements of that Entebbe story sound familiar to the details we've heard in recent days about the raid that brought another hijacker to justice. Before both missions, intelligence services surveyed the targets. Troops built and trained on an exact model before flying through the darkness to unfamiliar foreign terrain to what they had to do. The surprise mission was carried out with staggering speed and success. All the while it was kept under the highest secrecy. But these stunning operations have something much more important in common. In neither case was success a certainty, or really even a probability. Israel's leaders were far from confident a military strike would succeed in Entebbe. They wrestled with the tension and pressure and doubt. It was approved at last with hope, but also with a heavy heart. And 3 weeks ago, even as the helicopters were landing in that Pakistani compound, our troops were not certain that bin Laden was inside. America's leaders struggled with second and third guesses. But in the end, as in Entebbe before, decisive leadership led to definitive success. In both cases, those who designed, ordered, and carried out the mission operated on little more than circumstantial evidence. In other words, they acted on faith, the faith that their job is just and their duty is solemn. The faith of Herzl that tells us if we will it, it's no dream. So both nations decided the risks were worth taking because neither Israel nor America tolerates the terrorism that stains our past. We don't give in to fear. We stand up for the honor of our nations and our people. When we're attacked, we will always remember. We will always fight back, and though it may take some time, we follow through. Many nations take many risks. America and Israel, though, are the countries that make them count. We succeed. Americans and Israelis are the people who make possible the impossible. That's the spirit we need to recapture in the next pursuits of justice. The past 6 months have seen more remarkable change in the Middle East than any period in the past 6 decades since the State of Israel was born. This young story has been one of democracy, of human rights, a story written by those who know the voice of the people as valid as the voice of the palace, that it is just as legitimate and to be just as loud. Today, the Middle East and North Africa have captured the world's attention. Witnesses of history around the globe are rooting for democracy. But while we celebrate progress, and as the Arab Spring turns to summer, we must vigilantly protect the stability, security, and support of the State of Israel. And no one should forget, the vast majority of the Arab world is still not free. But for 63 years, a strong, vibrant democracy has flowered in the unlikeliest of deserts. It's a democracy dedicated to progress and prosperity and to the values that anchor the free world. So the thousands of us here tonight say, single voice, if you believe in democracy, believe in Israel. Three years ago, I wrote legislation in the United States Senate to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the founding of the modern State of Israel. It passed unanimously. When the whole world unfairly condemned Israel for defending herself in the flotilla incident, I didn't stay silent. I spoke up real loudly. I worked with Democrats and Republicans alike to collect almost 90 senators' signatures on a letter defending Israel's right to defend herself. And we all know that if we were attacked in the same way off our shores, the United States would have done nothing different. I've been happy to host many bipartisan Senate meetings with Israeli prime ministers, several with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I look forward to his address tomorrow in a rare joint meeting of Congress. I've always supported robust American aid to the State of Israel, and I always will. In Congress's budget last year, in a year when both domestic and international spending was slashed, we ensured Israel got the full funding it needs. Frankly, that was no easy task, but my senators stood by Israel. In Congress's next budget, I again support giving Israel full funding for security assistance. We will face an even tougher budget environment this year, but I'm committed to defending this critical aid. But aid alone is not enough. We support Israel because it is in our national and our security interests. We support Israel because she is what Isaiah called a light unto the nations. So we also must sustain her glow with all of our political might. The history of the Jewish people is in the land of Israel. Its future will be there too. I support a strong, democratic Jewish state of Israel living in peace and security with the Palestinian state. Like you, I hope sincerely for a true and lasting peace between Israelis and the Palestinian people. This conflict is older than many of us, but I refuse to believe that means it cannot be resolved by us in our lifetimes. These solutions are not simple. The only way to achieve delicate balance we seek between security and peace is through the hard work of negotiation. And I believe the parties that should lead these negotiations must be the parties at the center of this conflict and no one else. The place where negotiating will happen must be at the negotiating table and nowhere else. These negotiations will not happen. Their terms will not be set through speeches or in the streets or in the media. No one should set premature parameters about borders, about building, or about anything else. I support strongly the resolution Senators Cardin and Collins have introduced, which says a negotiated settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should come through direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. If we're going to have faith that peace talks will be fruitful, we must know that those having the conversation are doing so in good faith. And if we wish for these talks to be productive, to produce a fair ending, we must demand a fair beginning. What this means is that the Palestinians cannot bring to the negotiating table a terrorist organization that rejects Israel's right to exist. Nowhere else in the world, any place in the world, at no other time is one party expected to compromise with a partner who denies its very existence. A peace process can happen only when both sides seek peace. And two partners cannot build a bridge when one party refuses even to admit there's something on the other side of the span. My friend Shimon Peres is the most visionary foreign leader I've ever known. As he has said, a government that includes Hamas is a threat not only to Israel, it is a threat to the creation of the Palestinian state, a threat to the legitimacy of a new state, and a threat to the stability in the region. And we must never forget that these are the hostage-taking terrorists who have kept Sergeant Shalit from his family and fellow soldiers for almost 5 years. A fair beginning to good faith talks also means the Palestinians cannot simply stop by the negotiating table on their way to the United Nations, where they seek recognition that is at once purely symbolic and dangerously counterproductive. And a fair beginning to good faith talks means that Israel cannot be asked to agree to confines that would compromise its own security. Palestinians' cooperation in the following fundamental principle will also determine America's willingness to continue our current aid program. I'll say this as clearly as I can. The United States of America will not give money to terrorists bent on the destruction of the State of Israel. If the Palestinian government insists on including Hamas, the United States will continue to insist that Hamas recognize Israel's right to exist, that it renounce violence, and that it honor the commitments made by prior Palestinian Authority governments. I was there when the first of those governments was conceived. Some of you were there too, and many of you remember clearly the sunny September day on the south lawn of the White House. We watched two sworn enemies sign the same piece of paper, and as they clasped hands, peace seemed within our grasp too. Prime Minister Rabin spoke passionately that day about the promise of a new age. As a soldier and a father, he spoke of parents who were tired of war and dreamed of children who would not know war. But a child born on that day in 1993 will turn 18 years old at the end of this summer. Boys born in Haifa and girls born in Herzliya, as Rabin and Arafat shook hands in this city, are now counting down the days until they start their service to the IDF. And that child, the child who Rabin hoped would not know war, will still find himself or herself face to face with the same challenges of which his parents have grown very weary. We must remember the lessons of Oslo. We must weigh both the potential and the peril of negotiating for Israel's future, and we must do better. The Torah teaches us to honor our father and our mother. But I believe we must also honor our children by creating for them the chance to know peace. Now, that mission may be more daunting and success seem more improbable than even the most intrepid midnight raid. But we've seen that faith and fearlessness have won us before. The next generation will face another menace as well, one on which we cannot afford to lose focus amid the frustration and fatigue of the stammering peace process. The threat from Iran has not subsided. It cannot be underestimated or overstated. It is a common threat, a common enemy to both Israel and America. The president of Iran has made anti-Semitism his policy. He preaches vile propaganda and has articulated his regime's goal of erasing Israel from the map. While Iran torments its neighbors, it also brutalizes its own people. The world watched in horror as the regime murdered its own citizens in their own streets while they had done nothing but ask for the same basic freedoms all people desire. Sadly, these abuses continue today. Unjust executions, abductions by security forces, arbitrary arrest and detention, and yes, torture. As long as the terrorist state of Iran supports terrorist organizations in the Middle East, including Hamas and Hezbollah, as long as it hides behind these terrorists and uses them as proxies against Israel, as long as Iran continues to defy the international community by enriching uranium and brazenly defying United Nations security resolutions, America will stand against Iran for our sake and for Israel's sake. Iran's terrorist sympathies are only the beginning of the problem. We know Iran is pursuing nuclear weapon capability and the means to launch those weapons into Israel. These same weapons could also reach our allies in Europe. A nuclear arms race in the Middle East could destabilize the entire region, making existing conflicts volatile and more dangerous. The regime threatens the national security of Israel and the United States. We will not sit back and watch it develop nuclear weapons capability. This is why I worked so hard to pass last year's Iran sanctions bill, a bill that tells the Iranian regime, if you pursue nuclear weapons, you put your economy at risk. I thank each of you here tonight because it was your hard work that got this bill to the President's desk. Many of you personally came to Capitol Hill and made clear the urgent case for passing these sanctions, not just any sanctions. The AIPAC team was always there to make sure we passed the strongest legislation possible. You should be proud of what you accomplished. This program is comprehensive and it's tough. Our goal was to target Iran where it hurts the regime the most. So we imposed stringent new sanctions on its refined petroleum industry and on the international banking institutions that do business with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. We've already seen these sanctions work. Major international firms began pulling out of Iran because they didn't want to put their businesses at risk. Iran's economy has suffered as a result. Of course, Iran continues to get around these sanctions. We knew that would happen. So we have to keep our foot on the gas. We have to ensure that the administration fully implements and enforces sanctions and keep the pressure on our allies to do their part. The Senate will also be working on a new round of legislation that will help tighten the sanctions we already passed. None of us wants to go to war with Iran. We all hope economic pain on the other side will prevent human suffering on our side. But we will not wait forever, and we will not take any option off the table. President Kennedy, speaking of the great nuclear challenge of his time, reminded us that our problems are man-made and they can be solved by man. He said, "Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again." Israel and America have done the impossible before. We can do it again. We must do it again. Let me close how I began, with the story of a daring Israeli rescue mission, one that, to me, defines Israel too few see and know. It's evening here, but in the middle of the night in Israel, where it's already the 24th of May. It's now 20 years almost to the hour that Operation Solomon began. 20 years ago this month, civil war swept through Ethiopia. Over the previous year and a half, thousands of Ethiopian Jews have been brought to safety in Israel, but thousands more remained. In May 1991, Ethiopia's dictator fled and violent rebels controlled the capital. Time was ticking for the remaining Jews. Entire villages of men, women, and children who, though isolated from Israel and the rest of the diaspora, maintained the traditions of the Torah for thousands of years. Again, Israel's government and its partners executed a covert but flawless airlift, flying 36 overloaded aircraft for 36 tense hours to rescue more than 14,000 Jews, nearly the entire Jewish population of Ethiopia. The Beta Israel, as they were called, brought no clothes, no belongings. When they set foot on Israel's soil for the first time, their feet were indeed the first things to touch the ground. Many didn't even have shoes. Months after the rescue, my wife and I had the privilege of meeting with these new Israelis in Israel. I'll never forget the smiles that they wore on their faces and the gratitude they had in their hearts for the state of Israel. They were brought to an unfamiliar country and thrown into a vastly different culture, but they had come home, and they couldn't have been happier. 15 years after Entebbe, and thousands of years after the exodus from Egypt, Israel demonstrated once again the lengths it will travel and the risks it will take for the safety of the Jewish people. Israel demonstrated the unmatched precision and professionalism with which it operates. 20 years ago tonight, in the deepest darkness, Israel's light unto the nations shone as brightly as ever. This is the Israel AIPAC and Congress has to share with the world. This is the Israel that does not define itself by war and worry, but by hope. This is the Israel that has decided and dedicated itself to humanitarian aid and international development, since Ben-Gurion called on his young country to share, as he said, what little we have. This is the Israel that worked for years with USAID to help unemployed Egyptians plant new farms in the desert. This is the Israel that flew into Haiti hours after the earthquake and set hospital. It is the Israel that didn't wait a minute between hearing about the disaster in Japan and going there to help. This is the Israel that continues to work with Ethiopia to eradicate HIV from orphanages and establish state-of-the-art agricultural nurseries. This is the Israel that built the armor that keeps American soldiers safe. This is the Israel that gave a grant to a Jerusalem startup so it could invent the bandage that would save Congresswoman Gabby Giffords' life. You see, this is the Israel we love. This is the Israel we have supported since its earliest minutes. Before the ink had even dried on the Declaration of Israel's independence, with the name of the new state literally penciled in, America was the first nation to recognize Israel's right to self-determination and self-defense. We were there from the beginning, and we will be there with her for all time. America's commitment to Israel is incorruptible. It is non-negotiable, and we will never, never leave her side. Thank you very much.
Welcome AIPAC National Board Member Sander Gerber.
Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, John Boehner is our friend. Growing up as the second of 12 children in a small town in Ohio, John Boehner worked his way up from sweeping the floors in his family tavern to become one of our country's top leaders. He epitomizes the American dream. From his first days as a freshman member of Congress 20 years ago until now as Speaker of the House, John Boehner has always understood that those who threaten Israel threaten the United States as well. This understanding is not just intellectual for the Speaker, it is in his bones. And there is no greater security threat than the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is why John Boehner has been among the leaders in Congress pushing for the implementation of tough sanctions against the Islamic Republic for its nuclear ambitions and for its support of terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. For years, Hamas has fired rockets at Israeli civilians. And now, astonishingly, surprisingly, maybe yes, maybe not, the terrorist group is being welcomed back into the Palestinian Authority. And for years, the Speaker has worked to support security assistance to Israel in its fight against Hamas and terrorism, even in the face of enormous political pressure. In fact, just a few months ago, Congress was on the verge of government shutdown as both parties were fighting over how much to cut the budget. But when it came to Israel, Speaker Boehner assured and helped ensure, as he always has, that Israel's security would not be in question. As a result, the continuing resolution that Congress passed in April actually increased aid to Israel by approving more than $3 billion in security assistance for the Jewish state. In Yiddish, Boehner means bones. So when you think of John Boehner, don't think of him just as the Speaker of the House, but remember that his defense and his support of Israel is in his bones. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Speaker of the House.
Well, Sander, thank you for that kind introduction. And to all of you, thank you for what you do. You know, I've had a chance to meet so many of you over the years, not just those of you from Ohio, but throughout the country. So to be assembled under one roof feels like getting old friends back together again. And we've got an awful lot of catching up to do, don't we? You know, recent events bring to mind Henry Kissinger's lament at one point when he said, "There can be no crisis next week. My schedule is already full." Well, I thought about that when I was thinking about what I was going to say tonight. And I began to recall the last time that I was in Israel several years ago. I'll never forget visiting the northern border with Lebanon, standing there with the IDF soldiers, many of them 18, 19 years old. And the closest of the enemy hit me, how Israel doesn't get to choose its battle space. And where I stood on that border is about 100 miles from Jerusalem, about the same distance my home in Ohio is from our state capital in Columbus. As Speaker of the House, I feel a responsibility to help ensure that our nation keeps its political and financial commitments and maintains its role as the beacon of freedom and democracy. And it's in that spirit that I join with all of you tonight. Much has been said about the special bond between Israel and the United States. Ambassador Oren called Israel the ultimate ally, and I couldn't agree more. In the last 63 years, through all the threats that we have faced, America and Israel have formed and honed a strategic alliance built on trust and based on shared values. That is the reason we gather year in and year out to honor and strengthen, in a very public way, the historic friendship between our two great democracies. So we know the world is a dangerous place for democracies. We saw it in this country on 9/11. Israel sees it in the terrorist attacks that seem to come every month, or sometimes every day. Now, the death of Osama bin Laden marks an important victory in the fight against al-Qaeda and Islamic extremism. And our nation's military and intelligence professionals have achieved an important goal in our nation's and in all free nations' fight against terrorism, and I think they deserve our deepest appreciation. The terrorist organizations are more resilient than just one person. Al-Qaeda has been weakened, but they have not been destroyed. My job as Speaker is to ensure that the House remains focused on confronting and defeating the complex and evolving terrorist threat that still targets the United States and her allies. In Lebanon, Hezbollah cast out a freely elected government and dominates that country. And every day that terrorist organization, committed to the destruction of Israel, gets more weapons from Syria and from Iran. And looming over the entire region, of course, the Iranian regime and the threat it poses there and in the wider world. Now, there's no doubt that the regime in Tehran has taken notice of how the United States has responded to the threats in Libya versus how it has responded to the threats in North Korea. And if anyone here still doubts the Iranian regime's quest for nuclear weapons, I think you're awfully optimistic. And if anyone thinks that we can contain the aggression and terrorist subversion of a nuclear-armed Iran, you may not just be optimistic, but somewhat delusional. Now, the best remedy for the threat to the world is for the people of Iran to rise up and replace that regime, just as the people of Tunisia and Egypt have risen up and replaced their regimes. And we all hope that the regimes in Libya and Syria will be replaced as well, so that the peoples of those countries can escape tyranny and into freedom. Now, we should make it clear, and clearer than it has been for the last 2 years, that America is on the side of those who yearn and struggle for their own freedom. That is our historic and moral responsibility as a great and free nation, and we should never apologize or be ashamed of that role that we play in the world. That's why America's commitment to the advancement of democracy in the Middle East remains critical. And one of those democracies is Iraq. As President Obama recently said, Iraq represents the promise of a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian democracy. Now, Iraq is more than a simple democracy on the make. It is in a position to become a vital strategic ally in the region. And this is a tribute to the resilience of the Iraqi people, the sacrifices made by our troops and our diplomats, and the many nations that have played a role in this task. But we must remain committed to ensuring that Iraq continues toward a transition as a sovereign country that is capable of defending itself and is at peace with its neighbors. Now, let me be clear. Experience reminds us that one election does not constitute a transition to a viable and responsible democratic state. As Americans, we know that democracy means not just majority rule, but the rule of law, the protection of minority rights, the basic freedoms of religion, speech, and assembly. And yes, the Arab Spring marks an overdue rejection of corruption on police states, but now we're witnessing the battle for the region's political identity. Will they now build governments that respect human life and dignity, that uphold human rights, and where the people rule? Or will we see women and religious minorities repressed and fundamental rights abridged? Will we see one man, one vote, one time? We are watching the struggle to play out in Egypt, and fostering economic development in Egypt is important. But just as critical is the work to secure a strategic partnership with the people of Egypt that protects our interest and maintains their commitment to peace with Israel. And this brings me to Israel and to peace. I know the hour is late, but over in Jerusalem, the sun is just beginning to rise, and with it, another day of uncertainty. The work of achieving a safe and secure Israel has never been easy, but the cause is right. And I'll tell you that you have my 100% support for the cause of peace and support in Israel. Israel has demonstrated time and again that it seeks nothing more than peace with its neighbors. And in a negotiation, both sides need to make compromises. And like every prime minister before him, Prime Minister Netanyahu knows this and accepts it. But what does the other side want? When it embraces a terrorist organizations, I think it makes its intentions known. You know, where I come from, you're judged by the company that you keep. You know, there are some out there that complain that the United States is too pro-Israel. Well, let me tell you what I think. Doubts about what America stands for and who America stands with slows the search for peace and stability in the region. The President and the Congress should work together so that the American people, our friends, and yes, our enemies understand the national security policies and our goals, and so that our allies like Israel have no cause to doubt that we'll be with them through thick and thin. You know, before there was an AIPAC, securing American support for a Jewish state was the work of a dedicated few, including an historian by the name of Benzion Netanyahu. He said at one point, many people in those days had no faith. Today we hear the same kind of thing from people who believe that Israel must always give in. That view was wrong then, and it is wrong today. Tomorrow, his son, the Prime Minister of Israel, will address the United States Congress, marking another milestone in this historic friendship. I was honored to invite him, and it will be our honor to have him there. It'll be our honor to have him there, the representative of a free people who have overcome all odds to rebuild an ancient nation. Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations on the largest AIPAC gathering ever. Thank you for having me, and remember this, keep up the fight.
Hi, I'm here with two great champions in Congress of the U.S.-Israel relationship, Congresswoman Kay Granger of Texas, who is chair of the critically important House Appropriations Foreign Operations Subcommittee, and Congresswoman Nita Lowey of New York, who is the ranking Democrat on the critical House Appropriations Foreign Operations Subcommittee. Congresswoman Granger, tell me what U.S.-Israel defense cooperation means in your district.
Well, I'll be very specific. One of the companies, Israeli company, it's in Fort Worth, that's my hometown, a very, very exceptional defense contractor. When I first became acquainted with Elbit, there were 250 employees, 35 million in production. They're now at 700 employees, $1 billion. So, and they're very involved in the community, extremely active, contributing in education, the arts. I work with them very closely. That's how good it is.
Are those all jobs in your district?
They're all jobs in my district, and they're all, most of them are engineering jobs. Very, very high paying, very stable jobs, very important.
Thank you. Congresswoman Lowey, give me a big picture of what U.S. military aid means across the country, U.S. military aid to Israel.
75% of the aid that we appropriate for Israel is spent here in the United States of America in 50 states. That's an incredible spur to the economy. It creates jobs, and at a time where our economy is in difficulty and we're focused like a laser beam on creating jobs, knowing that 75% of the appropriated money is spent here makes an extraordinary difference.
Congresswoman Lowey, Congresswoman Granger, thank you so much for your time. There you have it, U.S. military aid to Israel creating jobs across the country. And now I toss it to my colleague, Ilana Decker.
Thanks. And now we need to start thinking about preparing for tomorrow. As we've said time and again, tomorrow is the most important day of the conference. So if you've made plans to lobby a member of Congress, but those plans have changed, we ask that you stop by one of the quick stop kiosks and let us know. We also want to start thinking about Policy Conference 2012, and we have an amazing deal for you. If you sign up for Policy Conference 2012, which takes place between March 4th and 6th of next year, you'll save 50% off the registration rate. Again, that rate is available only through 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, so you want to take care of that as soon as you can. Finally, doors open tomorrow morning at 8:15 for our plenary featuring Senators John Thune and Bob Casey, two wonderful friends of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, and also featuring a very special guest, former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar, who has made it part of his life's mission to stop delegitimization of Israel across the globe. Have a great night, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome AIPAC Chairman of the Board, David Victor.
Good evening. Well, before I introduce the Prime Minister, I want to mention how wonderful it is and how honored we are to be joined tonight by the First Lady of the State of Israel, Mrs. Sarah Netanyahu. Well, to say it's a tense time in the Middle East is to understate things quite a bit. Regime change in Egypt, protests in Syria, Hezbollah has seized power in Lebanon, NATO intervention in Libya, uprisings in Bahrain, Yemen, and the UAE. And meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority just welcomed Hamas into the government. And all the while, Iran continues its development of a nuclear weapon. But in the midst of the instability, America has one reliable ally. It has one dependable ally. It has one strategic ally, the Jewish state of Israel. And as he has many times before, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is here with us tonight to reaffirm his personal commitment to the United States and the bond that unites these two great democracies. The Prime Minister has always understood the everlasting ties that bind the United States and the Jewish state. Freedom, peace, security. These core principles have always defined both nations. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has worked with America to achieve each of these shared values. And one of our most treasured shared values is the pursuit of peace. But despite the Prime Minister's unprecedented efforts to bring the Palestinian leadership back to the negotiating table, the Palestinian Authority continues to refuse to meet with him. Its leadership set up conditions for entering talks, trying to define the negotiations before even entering the room. And it fanned the fire among its citizens, inciting protests and anti-Israel activity that has resulted in numerous Israeli deaths and a family being massacred. Yet despite these obstacles, the Prime Minister remains committed to negotiating a peace agreement based not on preconditions or a predetermined starting point, but rather on the results of direct talks. Additionally, the Prime Minister has been working closely with the United States to ward off the greatest threat to both nations, nuclear proliferation by the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is a challenge that keeps Benjamin Netanyahu up at night. For years, he has tried to warn the world about this dangerous threat. From bilateral meetings to the podium at the UN, Netanyahu has repeated his call that America and the West must come together to stop the Islamic Republic before it is too late. The Islamic Republic with a nuclear weapon threatens the shared values that have brought the United States and Israel together for 63 years. Despite the involving dangers and instability, it is these core tenets that bring the Prime Minister here today. It is that everlasting strategic partnership that enables him to speak to us with a sense of hope and optimism that the United States and Israel will continue to strengthen their relationship, reach new heights, and stand together to face all the evolving threats that challenge both nations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu.
My friends, before I talk about things about Israel, I want to say something about the scenes on television that I saw today and you have been seeing as well. When tragedy strikes America, Israel won't. Israel feels an immediate identification. And tragedy has struck America. In recent days, floods and tornadoes have claimed the lives of hundreds of Americans, including today in Joplin, Missouri. All I can say is, America, we're with you on this day, on every day. And that's very evident from the things I just heard from my two close friends, Speaker of the House John Boehner, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, you will lead the many friends who are here today, the distinguished senators and congressmen and congresswomen of the United States of America. I want to greet AIPAC President Lee Rosenberg. Rosie, I learned the other day that if I take you on, it's not going to be in basketball, it will be in soccer. And Executive Director Howard Core. Howard, you I'm not going to take on in anything. I want to welcome here also the representatives of the government of Israel, members of Knesset, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Jim Cunningham, Ambassador-designate Dan Shapiro, my beloved wife and the mother of our two boys, Sarah, and finally, our terrific ambassador to the United States, a man who knows a few things about the U.S.-Israel alliance, Michael Oren. To all our supporters in this great hall, and to the millions of supporters across this great land, the people of Israel, thank you. Thank you for your staunch commitment to Israel's security. Thank you for defending Israel's right to defend itself. Thank you for standing by Israel as it seeks a secure peace. Now, I heard tonight from all the speakers something that you know, that Israel is America's indispensable ally. You understand that Israel and America stand shoulder to shoulder, fighting common enemies, protecting common interests. You know that Israeli innovators help power computers, fight disease, conserve water, clean the planet. Your support for Israel flows from the heart. You see, it's not just what Israel does, it's what Israel is. Now let me explain that. Yesterday I had a great day. They let me out. Sarah and I could actually go for a walk. And I have to congratulate the American security services. They're a little more generous than ours. So we walked along the Potomac. And we got to visit Washington's majestic memorials. I read Jefferson's timeless words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." I read Lincoln's immortal address, "Government of the people, for the people, by the people." Now let me tell you why these words resonate so powerfully with me and with all Israelis. Because they're rooted in ideas first championed by our people, the Jewish people. The idea that all men are created in God's image, that no ruler is above the law, that everyone is entitled to justice. These are revolutionary Jewish ideas, and they were spoken thousands of years ago, when vast empires ruled the earth, vast slave empires ruled the world, and the Jews spoke these truths. Israel is the cradle of our common civilization. It's the crucible of our common values. And the modern state of Israel was founded precisely on these eternal values. And this is why Israel's more than 1 million Muslims enjoy full democratic rights. This is why the only place in the Middle East where Christians are completely free to practice their faith is the democratic state of Israel. And this is why Israel, and only Israel, can be trusted to ensure the freedom for all faiths in our eternal capital, the United City of Jerusalem. My friends, Israel and America have drawn from these deep wellsprings of our common values. We've forged an enduring friendship not merely between our governments, but between our peoples. Support for Israel doesn't divide America, it unites America. It unites the old and the young, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, and yes, Joe Lieberman, it even unites independents. I want to take this opportunity to salute one of the great senators in my lifetime, a man who's given unbelievable service to his country, America, and has been unbelievably dedicated to Israel and the Jewish people. Thank you, Joe Lieberman. You see, this broad support for Israel in the United States is a tremendous help and gives tremendous strength to my country. And since Harry Truman, Israel has looked to American presidents to stand by it as we meet the unfolding challenges of a changing world. Yesterday, President Obama spoke about his ironclad commitment to Israel's security. He rightly said that our security cooperation is unprecedented. He spoke of that commitment just in front of AIPAC. He spoke about it in 2 speeches heard throughout the Arab world. And he has backed those words with deeds. See, I know these are tough economic times. So I want to thank the President and Congress for providing Israel with vital assistance so that Israel can defend itself by itself. I want to thank you all for supporting the Iron Dome missile defense system. A few weeks ago, Hamas terrorists in Gaza fired 8 rockets at our cities, at Ashkelon and Beersheba. Now, these rockets never reached their targets. Iron Dome intercepted them in midair. For the first time, a missile defense system worked in combat. That's a precedent in military history. And I want to say, thank you, America. Now, America and Israel are cooperating in many other ways as well. We're cooperating in science, in technology, in trade, in investment. See, it's not only American companies that are investing in Israel, it's Israeli companies investing in America. In the last decade, Israeli companies have invested more than $50 billion in the United States. One of those Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You think they have these protests in Gaza? What a way to get a standing ovation. Thank you. So, one of those companies is investing just down the road in Richmond. It's a company that is building a food factory. Now, here's what it means: more business, more jobs, and yes, more hummus. Well, it's not just food we're bringing to America. Take medicine. Israel has advanced a cure for multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, cancer. We've developed mechanical means to make paraplegics walk again. We placed a tiny diagnostic camera inside a pill. I have not swallowed it, but I understand it's quite effective. And you've just heard of this miraculous bandage developed by an Israeli company that has helped save Congresswoman Gabby Giffords' life. And I wish Gabi, a great friend of Israel, refuah shlema, a happy, quick, speedy recovery. Israel and America are also cooperating to end the world's worst addiction, the addiction to oil. This dependence fuels terrorism. It poisons the planet. So we've launched a 10-year program in Israel to kick the habit, to find a substitute for gasoline. And if we succeed, we can change the world. We can change history. My friends, the American people's support for Israel is reflected in my invitation to address a joint meeting of Congress tomorrow. Thank you, John Boehner, for that invitation. Now, I will talk about the great convulsion taking place in the Middle East, the risks and the opportunities. And I will talk the dangers of a nuclear-armed Iran. And I will also outline a vision for a secure Israeli-Palestinian peace. I intend to speak the unvarnished truth, because now more than ever, what we need is clarity. And events in our region are finally opening people's eyes to a simple truth. Events in the region are opening people's eye to a simple truth. The problems of the region are not rooted in Israel. The remarkable scenes we're witnessing in town squares across the Middle East and North Africa are occurring for a simple reason. People want freedom. They want progress. They want a better life. For many of the peoples of the region, the 20th century skipped them by. And now 21st century technology is telling them what they missed out on. You remember that desperate fruit vendor in Tunis? Why did he set himself on fire? Not because of Israel. He set himself on fire because of decades of indignity, decades of intolerable corruption, and the millions who poured into the streets of Tehran, Tunis, Cairo, Sana'a, Benghazi, Damascus. They're not thinking about Israel. They're thinking of freedom. They're yearning for opportunity. They're yearning for hope for themselves and for their children. So it's time to stop blaming Israel for all the region's problems. Let me stress one thing. Peace between Israelis and Palestinians is a vital interest for us. It would be the realization of a powerful and eternal dream. But it is not a panacea for the endemic problems of the Middle East. It will not give women in some Arab countries the right to drive a car. It will not prevent churches from being bombed. It will not keep journalists out of jail. What will change this? One word: democracy, real, genuine democracy. And by democracy, I don't just mean elections. I mean freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, the rights for women, for gays, for minorities, for everyone. What the people of Israel want is for the people of the Middle East to have what you have in America, what we have in Israel, democracy. So it's time to recognize this basic truth. Israel is not what's wrong with the Middle East. Israel is what's right about the Middle East. My friends, we want peace because we know the pain of terror and we know the agony of war. We want peace because we know the blessings peace could bring, what it could bring to us and to our Palestinian neighbors. But if we hope to advance peace with the Palestinians, then it's time that we admitted another truth. This conflict has raged for nearly a century because the Palestinians refused to end it. They refused to accept the Jewish state. Now, this is what this conflict has always been about. There are many issues linked to this conflict that must be resolved between Israelis and Palestinians. We must resolve them. But I repeat, we can only make peace with the Palestinians if they're prepared to make peace with the Jewish state. Tomorrow in Congress, I'll describe what a peace between a Palestinian state and the Jewish state could look like. But I want to assure you of one thing. It must leave Israel with security, and therefore Israel cannot return to the indefensible 1967 lines. I'll talk about these and other aspects of peace tomorrow in Congress. But tonight I want to express Israel's gratitude for all you are doing to help strengthen Israel and the great alliance that Israel has with America. You help maintain our qualitative military edge. You back sanctions against Iran. You support a genuine peace. You oppose Hamas. And you've joined President Obama and me in denouncing Hamas and demanding that it release our captive soldier, Gilad Shalit. That's another outrageous crime of Hamas. Just imagine keeping a young soldier locked in a dark dungeon for 5 years without even a single visit, not a single visit of the Red Cross. I think that the entire civilized community should join Israel and the United States and all of us in a simple demand from Hamas: release Gilad Shalit. My friends, I spent my high school years in Philadelphia. Well, I understand it's developed quite a bit since then. But during those years, when it was a sleepier town, I used to go visit the Liberty Bell. Now, as Prime Minister of Israel, I can walk down the street and see an exact replica of that bell in Jerusalem's Liberty Park. On both bells is the same inscription. It comes from the Bible, from the book of Leviticus. Ukra'atem dror ba'aretz lechol yoshvea. Proclaim liberty throughout the land. My dear friends, this is the essence of the great alliance between our two nations. Two peoples bonded in liberty and seeking freedom and peace for all. That's what this alliance is all about. And you are part of it. You maintain it. I thank you on behalf of the people of Israel and the government of Israel. Thank you for the American-Israel alliance. Thank you, AIPAC.
Remarks from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee conference. You're watching live coverage on C-SPAN 2. Tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu will be